The Australian Protected Area Network is the full collection of land that's been set aside to some degree for biodiversity protection. The backbone of it is the National Reserve System, which are the national parks, the state-run parks, the marine reserves and the marine parks that are both federally and state managed, and they form a complex network of coverage across Australia. But on top of that, there are lots of land that's privately managed as part of the Protected Area Network, and that includes the Indigenous protected areas, some areas of land that have been bought by NGOs specifically to protect biodiversity, but there are also areas of land that are privately owned by private landowners, farmers and so on, that they've decided amongst themselves to commit to protect that area for biodiversity. So for a piece of land to be part of the protected area system, the owners of that land, be they public or private, have to have decided that they're prepared to protect that land pretty much in perpetuity for the benefits of biodiversity. The land obviously has to be in pretty good condition. So for a block of land to be part of the natural reserve system, it has to meet 3 criteria of biodiversity relevance, called the CAR system: Comprehensiveness, Adequacy and Representativeness. They're quite complex ideas, but if we talk about in the context of, say, a large national park like Kakadu, well, comprehensiveness means that the park maintains a full range of different ecosystems and habitats that occurs in that area. So Kakadu includes coastal areas, it includes the important wetlands that the wildlife and the bird communities use, but it also includes the dry sclerophyll inland areas with the escarpments and the communities that feed on them. So that's how Kakadu meets comprehensiveness. Adequacy is that the park's big enough for all of those species and communities to live and interact and breed and persist, so that's fairly obvious with Kakadu. Whereas representativeness reflects the fact that for each of those separate communities within the park, there is enough representation of those communities for those communities themselves to be able to be sustainable and persist. So to define a scale. But within Kakadu, that's a classic example of a national park that meets all the criteria. So we talked about those criteria in terms of Kakadu, but the reserve system is set up in the context of the whole of the Australian continent. And so we're trying to achieve comprehensiveness, adequacy and representativeness across all of the different ecological regions of Australia. So from the coasts to the inland deserts, to the rainforests, to the temperate forests of southern Australia. And obviously some of those regions are still pretty pristine, but others, such as the temperate woodlands on highly productive lands, have been highly degraded because of the use of that land for agriculture. And so the priorities as to where we set those reserves as part of the reserve system is also dependent on the degree to which those different regions are under threat. A very important part of the National Reserve System going forward is going to be the off-reserve conservation of land. The reserve system itself has been really built around public investment, but there's a full recognition we're not going to meet our targets if we depend entirely on public funding and public land. Off-reserve system, there has to be a motivation for why a private landowner would add their land to the National Reserve System, and there are an increasing number of government mechanisms that allow them to do so. There's the land stewardship process, where farmers and landowners can set aside land and manage it for biodiversity and attract funding from government or offsets from government. There are also covenants where people can decide that they're going to allocate land for biodiversity conservation for perpetuity, and various other mechanisms that allow private land to join the National Reserve System. There are 3 main ways in which science can really help the decision making around the National Reserve System in this day and age. The first is around deciding where and how you're going to set the reserve system up. A classic example of that is the reserve system around the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is used by many different communities and peoples for different purposes based on different values, and you need to incorporate those values as well as the biological information to define which areas you're going to set aside. And systematic conservation planning allows you to integrate the biological data with the social decision making to come up with the most acceptable reserve design for all people and all usage. That's the first. The second is called biodiversity data mapping, and it uses all the detailed biodiversity data we have across Australia, individual records of individual species, to map Australia based on those species records to understand where the most diverse and unique parts of Australia are that we know about, where are the ones likely to be that we don't know about, and we can use that information too to decide between different pieces of land where we might put our reserve or our national park or our extra piece of the protected area system. And the third tool we have now is the Atlas of Living Australia, which is a repository of all of the biodiversity data in Australia, but it has all of the information too, of course, about the threatened and endangered species and their precise locations. So we can use that detailed information to design the reserve system around protecting the threatened and endangered species. So we've talked a bit in detail about how detailed areas of biological sciences are starting to help reserve design. But science will have a much broader role to play in the future design of the national and planning of the National Reserve System. Social sciences can help in understanding the different values in different communities and helping them work together to effectively manage the land in the reserve system. But also science can help in the design of policy, effective policy for not only setting up good areas for biodiversity protection, but also in providing these incentives for bringing other players into the reserve system, such as landowners, such as mining companies, such as NGOs that are interested in biodiversity conservation.